The towering skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Cole's penthouse. Below, the city pulsed with life, horns blaring, people scurrying along rain-slicked sidewalks, taxis weaving through traffic with reckless precision. But up here, on the 52nd floor of his meticulously designed residence, everything was silent, perfect, controlled. Ethan stood at the vast window, sipping his morning espresso, the dark liquid smooth and bitter, just the way he liked it. A new day, another business conquest. His latest AI-driven merger was set to finalize within the next 48 hours, a deal that would increase Coltech's valuation by another $5 billion. The world saw him as a visionary, a mogul who turned data into gold, a man who never failed. Yet, despite the accolades, the magazine covers, and the exclusive invitations to galas and private island retreats, a quiet emptiness had settled in his bones. He had built an empire from the ground up, but what had he sacrificed in the process? Love, family, purpose? He checked his watch. 6:15 a.m. His schedule was planned down to the minute, every aspect of his life structured for maximum efficiency. He had a breakfast meeting with the investment board at 7, a call with international partners at 9, a strategy session at 11. There was no room for uncertainty, no space for distractions. A discreet chime from his phone signaled an incoming message. Vivian, his assistant, as precise as ever. Vivian, your car will be downstairs in 10 minutes. The AI sector report is prepped. Also, Dr. Matthews called about your annual physical. He'd like to reschedule. Ethan exhaled sharply and typed a quick reply. Ethan, decline. I'll call him when I have time. He set his phone down and rolled his shoulders, adjusting the cufflinks of his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He'd deal with the checkup later. It wasn't like it would change anything. The damage had already been done 10 years ago. At 25, he had survived a brutal battle with testicular cancer. The doctors had been clear. His fertility was a casualty of the aggressive treatment. It was a fact he had accepted, filed away like a statistic in a business report. He never spoke about it. He never allowed it to matter. He had built an empire, and that was enough. Wasn't it? The sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of Coltech's headquarters, a gleaming glass fortress in the heart of Manhattan. Ethan stepped out, nodding briefly to the doorman as he strode through the lobby. Employees murmured greetings as he passed, some with admiration, others with barely concealed intimidation. He had cultivated that reputation carefully. He was the man who demanded perfection, who accepted nothing less than absolute excellence. Vivian met him at the elevator, tablet in hand, already running through the day's agenda. The investors are expecting updates on the acquisition, she said briskly. Mendoza wants a private meeting before the board call, and there's another request from Forbes for an exclusive interview. Decline the interview, Ethan said as the elevator doors slid shut. Tell Mendoza he gets 10 minutes, no more. Vivian arched a brow but said nothing. She had been his assistant for years. She knew better than to push. Yet today he sensed a flicker of something in her usually impassive gaze. Curiosity? Concern? What? Ethan asked, glancing at her. You look preoccupied, she said, tapping a note into her tablet. Unusual for you. Ethan said nothing as the elevator ascended, the smooth hum filling the silence. Preoccupied, number-focused, determined, perhaps even slightly unsettled, but not preoccupied. Yet, as the doors opened to his executive suite, he knew she wasn't entirely wrong. There had been a moment, a brief, fleeting second that morning, where he had stared at his reflection in the mirror and wondered how his life had turned out like this. His father had left when he was 10, packed a suitcase one evening and never came back. He remembered his mother crying at the kitchen table, the way the silence in their home had stretched for months. He had promised himself as a boy that if he ever had children, He would never be that kind of father. But what did that promise matter now? He could never have children. His phone buzzed again. Another meeting, another deal, another step toward a future he had crafted so carefully. Ethan straightened his tie, exhaled slowly, and walked into the boardroom. He was the master of his fate. He had built an empire. He was untouchable. Then why did it feel like something was missing? Ethan rarely deviated from his routine. Every morning was a calculated sequence: workouts at 6, coffee precisely at 7, the office by 8. His world was measured, predictable. And yet, on this particular morning, something made him change course. Instead of heading straight to his office after his workout, he found himself walking a few blocks down to Joe's Brew, a small coffee shop tucked between a vintage bookstore and a boutique wine shop in Soho. He had been coming here for years, appreciating its quiet charm and lack of pretension. It wasn't the kind of place frequented by Manhattan's elite, which made it the perfect spot to collect his thoughts. The warm scent of roasted espresso beans filled the air as he stepped inside. The low hum of conversation and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine blended into the background. He approached the counter, nodding to Diane, the owner, who greeted him with a knowing smile. "The usual, Mr. Cole?" she asked. "Please." "And Diane, for the 100th time, it's just Ethan." She chuckled, shaking her head as she went to prepare his order. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Just 5 minutes of peace. That was all he needed before the chaos of the day began. But peace was the last thing he found. Near the back of the shop, a commotion caught his attention. 2 boys, identical in appearance, were arguing over a handheld gaming device. One wore a Yankees cap, tilted slightly to the side, while the other had neatly combed hair. Their animated gestures, their matching blue eyes, their unmistakable dimples. It was like looking into a mirror from the past. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He felt an inexplicable pull, his heartbeat thrumming in his ears as he took a slow step toward them. The resemblance was uncanny, undeniable. Diane followed his gaze and smiled. "Those 2? They're quite a handful. That's Archer and Jackson Reed. Their guardian, Olivia, brings them here sometimes." His mouth felt dry. "Their guardian?" "She runs a youth program for foster kids," Diane explained. "Wonderful woman. The boys have been with her for a while now." Ethan barely heard the rest of her words. His gaze remained fixed on the boys, cataloging every detail: the shape of their noses, the way one furrowed his brow in concentration, the same way he did during tense negotiations. Their voices, one slightly deeper than the other, felt hauntingly familiar. Impossible. He had been told he could never have children. Then why was he looking at 2 boys who had his face? Ethan Cole had always considered himself a man of reason. He built his empire on logic, strategy, and meticulous planning. There were no coincidences in his world, only cause and effect. But as he stood on the sidewalk outside Joe's Brew, coffee cooling in his grip, staring at the twin boys through the cafe window, all his carefully curated logic abandoned him. They were identical to him. The same piercing blue eyes, the same dimpled smiles, the same square jaw. Even the subtle way one boy furrowed his brow as he argued over a video game was an exact mirror of Ethan's own expressions during tense negotiations. It was as if he were staring at a childhood reflection of himself, doubled. His pulse roared in his ears. It's impossible. The doctors had been definitive after his cancer diagnosis a decade ago. Sterile, no biological children. So how the hell were there 2 boys who looked exactly like him sitting in this cafe? Ethan forced himself to breathe, to think. Maybe it was a trick of genetics, a coincidence. Maybe he was imagining the similarities. But deep in his gut, where intuition whispered truths before logic caught up, he knew. This was real. "Mr. Cole, you all right?" Diane, the cafe owner, tilted her head as she wiped down the counter, eyeing him with curiosity. He barely heard her. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice hoarse, unfamiliar. Diane followed his gaze, her expression softening. "Oh, Archer and Jackson? Sweet kids. They're with Olivia Carter. She runs Bright Futures, the foster program. Brings different kids in here sometimes to give them a break from all that system nonsense." Olivia Carter. The name meant nothing to him, but the twins did. Ethan set his coffee down so abruptly it splashed over the rim, but he didn't care. "Where do they live?" Diane raised an eyebrow. "You're asking a lot of questions, Mr. Cole." Ethan pulled himself together, forcing a neutral expression. "I just thought I recognized them." Diane hesitated, then shrugged. "They've been in the system since they were babies. Bounced around a lot, but Olivia's been their guardian for the last year." She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's sad, really. No permanent home yet." Ethan swallowed hard. His hands curled into fists at his sides. No permanent home, no family. They had his face, his blood, he was certain of it now. Yet they had nothing. He had everything. A multi-billion-dollar company, a penthouse in the sky, more wealth than he could ever spend. And they had nothing. A surge of protectiveness, one he didn't recognize, rose in his chest. His mind was racing through scenarios, through legalities, through what he needed to do next. The boys were laughing now, completely unaware of the storm they had just unleashed in his world. Ethan turned back to Diane. "This Olivia Carter, where can I find her?" Diane frowned. "Why do you care so much?" Ethan didn't have an answer, not one he was ready to admit. So he did what he did best. He made things happen. He pulled out his phone, typing a quick message to his private investigator. "Find everything you can on Olivia Carter and the twins, immediately." Then he turned back toward the cafe window, watching as Olivia, whom he assumed was the woman gathering their things, tucked a strand of chestnut-brown hair behind her ear and ushered the boys toward the exit. Ethan stepped back into the shadows of the busy street as they passed. The boys chattered excitedly, completely unaware of his presence, while Olivia smiled at them with a kind of warmth Ethan had never seen in his own childhood. They were his. He knew it. And now there was only one thing left to do: find the truth. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the dossier his investigator had sent over. Name: Olivia Carter. Age: 32. Occupation: founder and director of Bright Futures, a nonprofit organization focused on foster care advocacy. Education: Master's in Social Work, Columbia University. Current guardianship: twin boys, Archer and Jackson Reed. His jaw clenched. Reed, not Cole, not his name. Yet he knew. His investigator had also pulled the adoption files. There was almost nothing in them. No listed father. No details on how they entered the foster system. Just a mother's name that made Ethan's breath catch. Caroline Reed. The past hit him like a freight train. Caroline, his first real love at Yale. The woman who had vanished without a trace in their junior year, leaving only a brief, impersonal message about family emergencies before disappearing. Ethan had searched for her, at first. But his career had exploded, and he buried that pain beneath success. She'd never told him she was pregnant. She'd never given him a choice. And now, she was gone. His fingers tightened around the paper, anger mixing with an ache he didn't want to name. Why had she kept them from him? He wasn't sure which feeling was stronger, the betrayal or the grief. Taking a deep breath, he closed the file and stood. Tomorrow he would meet Olivia Carter, and he would get answers. The Bright Futures building was nothing like the sleek glass towers Ethan was used to. It was old but full of life, walls painted in bright colors, children's laughter echoing from inside. He stepped through the front door, and immediately a receptionist blinked up at him in shock. Mr. Cole?" He wasn't surprised that she recognized him. His face had graced too many Forbes covers for anonymity. "I'm here to see Olivia Carter," he said. The receptionist hesitated. "She's busy. If you want to make an appointment, tell her it's about Archer and Jackson." That did the trick. Minutes later, he was led into an office where Olivia Carter stood behind her desk, arms crossed, eyes full of suspicion. "Mr. Cole," she said, voice steady but guarded, "I was wondering when you'd show up." Ethan arched a brow. "You knew who I was?" She nodded. "You've been following us. No point in lying." "Yes." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Why?" Ethan exhaled, stepping forward, his voice quieter now. "Because of the boys." Olivia stiffened, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. "They look like me," he said simply, "and I need to know why." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Olivia spoke. "Then I suggest you sit down, Mr. Cole, because this conversation won't be simple." Ethan did, and for the first time in his life, he realized he might not be prepared for what came next. Ethan Cole had negotiated billion-dollar deals, outmaneuvered ruthless competitors, and built an empire from nothing. He had walked into hostile boardrooms where men twice his age had underestimated him, only to leave them scrambling to keep up. But sitting across from Olivia Carter in the small, cluttered office of Bright Futures, with 2 chairs wedged between an overflowing bookshelf and a desk stacked with case files, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Powerless. Because the truth he needed, wasn't something he could buy or command. And Olivia Carter was not going to make this easy for him. She studied him with assessing brown eyes, her arms crossed in a posture that told him she had already decided he was a problem to be handled, not a solution to be welcomed. "I don't know what you're expecting to find here, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But if you think you can walk in and lay claim to Archer and Jackson just because you have money and a vague resemblance—" "They're mine." The words came out harder than he intended, clipped with the certainty of a man used to getting answers. But Olivia didn't flinch. If anything, her expression grew colder. "And you're basing that on what, exactly?" she challenged. "A hunch? Because that's not how this works." Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, lowering his voice to something more measured. "I ran a background check, Ms. Carter. I know their mother's name." At that, something flickered across her face. A crack in the armor. "Caroline Reed," he said. The name still tasted like regret on his tongue. "She and we were together in college. Then she disappeared. She never told me she was pregnant." Olivia's fingers twitched against her sleeve, but she masked it quickly. "And what do you expect me to do with that information?" she asked. "I expect you to tell me what happened," he said. "How they ended up here. How my sons—" "They're not your sons." Her voice cut through the room like steel, her eyes burning with a protective fire he hadn't expected. "They're 2 little boys who have already been let down by too many people," she continued. "And I won't let them be another casualty of some rich man's curiosity." Ethan's jaw tightened. "This isn't curiosity." "Then what is it?" she demanded. "Guilt? Some last-minute desire to play hero?" He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to rein in his temper. "I want the truth." Olivia stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he deserved it. Then, with a sigh, she reached for a thin folder on her desk and pushed it toward him. "That's all I have," she said. "But I'm warning you. What you find may not be the answer you're looking for." Ethan's fingers tightened around the folder before he flipped it open. Inside were copies of old court documents, social services reports, and medical records. And right there, at the top of the first page, He saw it. Mother, Caroline Reed. Father, unknown. His stomach turned. She had never put his name down, never even given him a chance. But it got worse. As he skimmed the pages, he saw the timeline. Caroline had given birth alone in Seattle. Just over 10 years ago. 3 months later, she had relinquished custody, citing financial hardship and medical concerns. 6 months after that, she had been diagnosed with cancer. 3 years ago, she had died. Ethan closed the folder. His hands felt like stone. Olivia's voice was softer now. She loved them, she said, but she was scared, sick, and she believed giving them up was the only way to protect them. He exhaled, his throat tightening. She didn't even tell me. I know. Olivia leaned back, watching him carefully. And that's something you're going to have to live with. But that doesn't change the fact that you're a stranger to them. Ethan set the folder down. Not for long. I want a DNA test, he said. Olivia's eyes darkened. And if it comes back positive? What then? I want to be in their lives. She shook her head. That's not how this works, Mr. Cole. Then how does it work? His voice edged toward frustration. Because I'm not walking away. You think you can just show up, flash some paperwork and claim them? Olivia shot back. They're not some acquisition, Ethan. They're children. They have feelings and memories and fears. You don't get to disrupt their world just because it suddenly matters to you. Her words stung, mostly because they carried a painful truth. For 10 years he had lived his life never knowing they existed. Now he couldn't unknow it. Olivia's expression softened just slightly. They've been through enough instability, she said. If you want a DNA test, fine, but I won't let you hurt them. If you're going to be in their lives, it has to be for the right reasons. Not guilt, not curiosity, and definitely not ego. Ethan's throat worked as he swallowed the sharp retort that wanted to rise. She wasn't wrong. He had spent his life controlling everything. But this wasn't something he could control with money or power. This was something else entirely. After a long pause, he exhaled and nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. Olivia searched his face, as if trying to determine if he truly meant it. Then she nodded. Okay, I'll arrange for the test. Ethan stood. He had won the first battle, but he knew this war was far from over. As he turned to leave, Olivia spoke again. They don't know, she said quietly. Ethan looked back. They don't know anything about their biological parents, she clarified. They think they were just left behind. Something inside him clenched. They deserve better than that, he said. Yes, Olivia agreed. They do. And with that, Ethan Cole walked out of Bright Futures, determined to change everything, even if he had no idea how. Ethan Cole wasn't used to waiting. His world ran on efficiency, meetings scheduled down to the minute, deals finalized in record time, and problems solved before they even had a chance to take root. But this, waiting for a DNA test, for Olivia Carter to give him another meeting, for answers he wasn't sure he was ready to hear, was something else entirely. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he wasn't in control, and he hated it. Ethan strode into Bright Futures with purpose, his polished dress shoes echoing on the worn tile floor. He was greeted by curious glances, a mixture of awe and skepticism. He knew he didn't belong here, the billionaire in a world of struggling foster kids and overworked social workers. But he was here anyway. Olivia was waiting for him in her office, arms crossed. The test results came back this morning, she said, getting straight to the point. Ethan exhaled slowly, his pulse quickening. And? Her expression softened just slightly as she pushed a piece of paper across the desk. 99.9% certainty. They're yours. He had prepared for this. He knew this would be the result, and yet seeing it in black and white stole his breath. His hands curled around the edge of the paper, as if holding it too tightly would somehow ground him. Archer and Jackson Reed were his biological sons. His chest tightened. He had 2 sons, and he had already missed 10 years of their lives. "You okay?" Olivia's voice was quieter now, almost cautious. Ethan blinked, regaining control of his expression before nodding. "Yes, I just—" He ran a hand through his hair. "I wasn't sure how this would feel." Olivia studied him carefully. "You don't have to figure it out in a day." "Maybe not." He set the paper down. "But I want to see them." She tensed, just like he expected. "Ethan, you said I'd have to earn my place," he cut in. "I understand that. But now that we know the truth, you can't expect me to sit back and do nothing." Olivia sighed, rubbing a hand over her temple. "They don't know anything about you. Walking in and saying, 'Hey, I'm your father,' isn't going to work." "I know that," he admitted, "but I have to start somewhere." She was silent for a long moment before exhaling. "Fine, but on my terms." Ethan arched a brow. "Which are?" "You meet them as a volunteer, someone visiting the youth center. No big announcements, no pressure, just get to know them." He frowned. "You want me to lie?" "I want you to build trust before you drop life-altering news on them," she corrected. "You can't force them into this, Ethan. You have to show them they matter to you, not just because they share your DNA." His jaw clenched. He didn't like it, but he knew Olivia wasn't wrong. "Fine," he said. "I'll play by your rules." She raised an eyebrow. "We'll see." Ethan stood in the Bright Futures recreation room, feeling more out of place than he had in years. The room was chaotic in the best way, kids laughing, volunteers helping with homework, and a few playing board games at scattered tables. And then he saw them, Archer and Jackson. They were sitting on the floor, a few feet apart. Jackson was animated, trying to convince Archer that their video game strategy needed to be more aggressive. Archer, ever the thinker, was considering his brother's words carefully before responding. Ethan swallowed hard. "Hey, new guy." He turned to see Olivia watching him with a smirk. "You gonna stand there all day, or are you actually going to introduce yourself?" Ethan exhaled sharply and walked forward. This was it. As he approached, Jackson noticed him first. "Who are you?" the boy asked, blinking up at him. His Yankees cap was pulled low over his messy platinum blonde hair just like Ethan's. "I'm Ethan," he said, crouching down to their level. "Olivia asked me to help out today." Jackson studied him suspiciously. "You don't look like the volunteering type." Ethan smirked. "What does a volunteer look like?" Jackson narrowed his eyes, clearly unimpressed by the expensive suit Ethan had traded for a casual sweater and jeans. "Not like that," Jackson said bluntly. Ethan chuckled. "Fair enough." Archer, quieter but more observant, tilted his head. "What do you do?" Ethan considered his answer carefully. "I run a company." Jackson perked up. "A company? Like video games?" Ethan shook his head. "No, it's a technology company. We work with artificial intelligence, software, things like that." Archer's interest sharpened. "Like coding?" Ethan smiled. "Exactly like coding." Jackson groaned. "Boring." Archer ignored him. "Do you write code yourself?" "I used to," Ethan admitted, "before I ran out of time." "Why'd you stop?" Ethan hesitated. "Because I got too busy making money." Archer frowned. "That seems like a bad trade." Ethan blinked. The kid was sharp. Before he could respond, Jackson nudged his brother. "Ask him." Archer sighed, then looked at Ethan. "Do you know how to build a computer?" Ethan's lips twitched. "I built my first one when I was 12. Archer's eyes widened. "Seriously?" Ethan nodded. "And if you want, I could teach you." Archer's gaze flickered with something close to excitement before he masked it quickly. Maybe. Jackson crossed his arms. Okay, but can you play baseball? Ethan smirked. Second base. Jackson's jaw dropped. Me too. Ethan leaned in slightly. Think you could take me in a game? Jackson puffed out his chest. Definitely. Ethan chuckled, his chest tightening at how easily this felt right. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or investors. He was just here, with his sons, and he was never letting them go. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cole was nervous. Not the kind of nervousness that came before a billion-dollar acquisition or a high-stakes negotiation. No, this was new territory, an unfamiliar sensation pressing against his chest as he approached bright futures for the second time in 3 days. This wasn't about winning. This was about being chosen. By 2 little boys who had no idea he was their father. Ethan stepped inside, scanning the room. It was livelier than before. Kids racing down the hall, volunteers managing an art station, the faint sound of a basketball bouncing from outside. He caught sight of Olivia Carter near the corner, her warm brown eyes already on him. She lifted a brow, as if assessing whether he had actually come back. He smirked. Told you I'd be here. She didn't smile, but there was a slight softening in her gaze. We'll see if the boys feel the same way. Ethan exhaled slowly and turned. Archer and Jackson were exactly where he had left them, huddled over their game console, engaged in an intense debate over strategy. Jackson saw him first. His eyes flicked up, then back to the screen. Archer followed. Ethan waited. Would they ignore him? Brush him off? He wasn't prepared for the small spike of uncertainty that came next. Then Jackson waved him over, and just like that, something in Ethan's chest loosened. You showed up, Jackson said as Ethan crouched beside them. You sound surprised. Jackson shrugged. A lot of adults don't. Ethan clenched his jaw. The weight of that statement settled deep in his bones. I said I would, he replied simply. Archer, ever the observer, studied him. Do you always keep your promises? The question hit hard, because in business, yes, always. But in personal relationships? He hadn't kept his promise to Caroline. He hadn't searched for her. I try to, he admitted, especially when it matters. Archer considered this, then passed him a controller. Then let's see how good you are at keeping your word. Ethan raised a brow. Are we talking about the video game or something else? Archer's lips twitched. Both. Ethan exhaled, then turned his attention to the screen. All right, boys. Show me how this works. They played for almost an hour. Ethan lost spectacularly. To both of them. Jackson cackled every time Ethan made a mistake, while Archer explained the mechanics with surgical precision. Ethan didn't care about losing. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about Coltech, his empire, or the next deal waiting in his inbox. He was thinking about them, about how Jackson talked with his hands, how Archer's eyes lit up when discussing strategies, how both boys were sharp, quick-witted, and fearless in their own ways, and how much he had already missed. Ethan was mid-laugh, an actual laugh, one he didn't even recognize in himself, when Olivia called from across the room. Jackson, Archer, time to get ready for tutoring. Jackson groaned. 5 more minutes? Olivia gave him a pointed look. Jackson turned to Ethan, attempting his best puppy dog eyes. Ethan smirked. Don't look at me. You're on your own. Jackson sighed dramatically but got up. Archer followed, but before they left he paused. Are you coming back? Archer asked, his voice quieter than before. Ethan met his gaze and didn't hesitate. Yes. And for the first time Archer nodded as if he believed him. After the boys left, Olivia approached. That went better than expected. Ethan smirked. I have my moments. She crossed her arms. So what now? He leaned against the table, exhaling. They trust me, a little. It's a start. Which brings us back to the real question, Olivia said, watching him carefully. What happens when you tell them the truth? Ethan clenched his jaw. She continued. You're building something with them, Ethan. But if you're not careful, if you rush this, it could backfire. The last thing those boys need is another disappointment. His grip tightened. I won't be a disappointment. Then prove it, Olivia said, softer this time. Not to me, to them. Ethan met her gaze. For once he wasn't thinking about control, about what was efficient or strategic. He was thinking about what was right. Tell me what they need, he said. I'll do it. Olivia studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed. All right, let's start with something small. He arched a brow. Like what? She smirked. Like a game of baseball. The next Saturday, Ethan stood in a community baseball field, holding a glove that hadn't seen action in years. Jackson, in his Yankees cap, was bouncing on his heels, while Archer adjusted his grip on the bat, deep in concentration. Olivia stood near the dugout, arms crossed, watching. Ethan smirked. Challenge accepted. All right, Jackson, let's see that arm. Jackson grinned and pitched. Ethan caught it, the satisfying thud echoing in his chest. And as Archer took his stance at the plate, brows furrowed in focus, Ethan realized something. This wasn't about proving he could be their father. This was about earning the right to be. Ethan Cole had never been a patient man. Patience was for people without power, without resources, people who waited while the world decided their fate. Ethan had spent his entire life making things happen, forcing open doors, shaping outcomes to his will. But this, waiting for two 10-year-old boys to choose him, was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. And he hated it. Ethan arrived at Bright Futures on a crisp Saturday afternoon, baseball glove in hand, dressed in casual jeans and a simple button-down. It had been 1 week since his first visit to the field, where he had pitched for Jackson and coached Archer through his first proper swing. 1 week since he had felt something shift, not just in the boys, but in himself. Now, it was time to see if they felt the same. As he stepped into the rec center, Olivia greeted him with her usual air of quiet suspicion. You keep showing up, she observed, handing him a clipboard. You keep letting me in, Ethan countered smoothly. She arched a brow. For now. He glanced down at the clipboard. What's this? Sign-in sheet, she smirked. You're a volunteer, remember? Ethan huffed a laugh but signed his name. Where are they? Outside. Olivia motioned toward the back of the center. Jackson's showing off his pitching. Archer's reading under a tree, probably ignoring him. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped out into the bright afternoon light and scanned the open space until he spotted them. Jackson, in his ever-present Yankees cap, was mid-throw, his small frame twisting as he launched the ball across the field toward another kid. Archer, exactly as Olivia predicted, sat beneath a maple tree, nose buried in a thick hardcover. Ethan's chest tightened. The more he watched them, the more undeniable it became. They were his, and now all he had to do was earn the right to be theirs. All right, Jackson, Ethan called as he approached. Let's see if your pitch is any better this week. Jackson whirled, eyes lighting up with surprise, and something warmer. You came back, Ethan smirked. Told you I would. Jackson ran up, grinning ear to ear. I've been practicing. He threw a quick glance at Archer, who remained seated under the tree. Arch, come on, he's here. Archer hesitated, carefully marking his page before standing and joining them. He didn't say much, but Ethan saw the difference. Less hesitation, less doubt. "Show me what you got, Jackson," Ethan said, stepping back. Jackson took position, eyes locked in fierce determination. He wound up and threw hard. Ethan caught the ball with a satisfied grunt. "Much better." He tossed it back. "But your stance could use some work." Jackson puffed his chest out. "I have a stance." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, and it needs to be stronger. Step into your throw. Use your legs." As he guided Jackson through his form, Archer watched closely. Ethan glanced at him. "You want to try?" Archer crossed his arms. "I don't play sports." "You didn't play video games either, but you still beat me last time," Ethan pointed out. Jackson snickered. "Yeah, he destroyed you." Archer's lips twitched, but he shook his head. "I like reading better." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "What are you reading?" Archer hesitated, then held up his book, A Beginner's Guide to Coding. Ethan's chest tightened. "Good choice," he said. "I built my first computer when I was your age." Archer's eyes lit up. "You did?" Ethan nodded. "If you want, I could teach you." For the first time, Archer actually smiled. And just like that, another bridge was built. As the afternoon stretched on, Ethan helped Jackson refine his pitch, explained basic programming concepts to Archer, and realized something terrifying. He liked being here, more than anything. And then, as they packed up to go inside, Jackson hit him with a question that nearly knocked him off his feet. "Are you going to be our new foster dad?" Silence. Ethan's chest locked. Archer, eyes sharp and calculating, looked between Jackson and Ethan, watching his reaction. Ethan hesitated. He could feel Olivia's gaze from the distance. She had warned him not to push too fast, not to promise something he wasn't ready for. So instead, he crouched down to their level and told them the truth. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I do know that I want to be in your lives." Jackson blinked. "Like, forever?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said softly. "If you'll let me." For the first time, Archer and Jackson looked at him differently. Not as a coach, not as a volunteer, but as someone who wasn't leaving. That evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, Olivia cornered him near the exit. "You handled that well," she admitted. "But this isn't just about what you want, Ethan." "I know," he said. She crossed her arms. "They're getting attached. You need to be sure before you go any further." Ethan met her gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything." She studied him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she nodded. "You should tell them the truth soon," she said. "But when you do, be ready for what comes next." Ethan exhaled. What came next? Everything. And this time, he wouldn't run from it. Ethan Cole had built his empire on information and strategy, knowing when to strike, when to hold back, and when to deliver a calculated blow. But this? Telling two little boys that he was their father? There was no strategy for this, no perfect script. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the one thing he despised most: fear. Olivia had given him one last warning before he stepped inside the rec center. "Whatever you do, don't overwhelm them. They've never had stability. If you're going to do this, make sure you're in it for good." Ethan hadn't responded. He knew his answer already. He was in this. For them. No matter what. Inside, he found Archer and Jackson in their usual spots. Jackson at the makeshift baseball pitching station, Archer seated at a nearby table, poring over a book. When Jackson spotted him, his face lit up. "You're late," he called, jogging over. Ethan smirked. "I wasn't aware we had an official schedule." Jackson huffed. "We do now." Archer glanced up from his book, then set it down and walked over as well. His sharp gaze scanned Ethan, as if sensing something different. Ethan had planned to ease into the conversation. Maybe play a game first, or let them guide the topic. But Archer beat him to it. You look nervous, Archer observed. Ethan blinked. Do I? Yeah, Jackson added, like you just had a dentist appointment or something. Ethan exhaled slowly. This was it. I need to tell you both something important, he said. The playful energy shifted. Jackson frowned. Is it bad? Ethan shook his head. But it might be a lot to take in. Archer's fingers tightened slightly at his sides. Okay. Ethan took a breath, the deepest one of his life. And then he said it. I'm your father. Complete deafening silence. Ethan watched as two young faces processed the words. Archer's expression remained still, unreadable, but his knuckles were white against his jeans. Jackson's jaw dropped. What? Jackson breathed. Ethan swallowed. I just found out recently. I didn't know before. If I had... He stopped, running a hand over his face. I would have been here. Still, silence. And then, Jackson laughed. That's a good joke, Jackson said, still grinning. Wait, are you serious? Ethan's chest ached. Yes. Jackson's smile fell. Archer, who hadn't said a word yet, suddenly turned and walked away. Ethan's stomach plummeted. Archer, he called. Please. But Archer didn't stop. He grabbed his book, tucked it under his arm, and disappeared into the hallway. Jackson, still standing beside Ethan, looked between them. He's mad. Ethan clenched his jaw. I can see that. Jackson kicked at the floor. I don't think he believes you. Ethan exhaled. Do you? Jackson hesitated, eyes darting between Ethan's and his own reflection in the window. You do kinda look like us, Jackson admitted. Ethan let out a short laugh. Yeah, kind of. But if it's true... Jackson swallowed. Why didn't you come before? Ethan crouched down, lowering himself to Jackson's level. Because I didn't know, he said, voice firm but gentle. Your mom, she never told me. Jackson frowned. She didn't? Ethan shook his head. Jackson was quiet for a long time. Then, in a smaller voice, he asked, So, you're not going to leave, right? Ethan's chest tightened painfully. I won't, he promised. Jackson studied him for another long second, then finally nodded. But Archer was still missing. Ethan found Olivia in the hallway, already aware of what had happened. He took off toward the library, she said before Ethan could ask. Ethan nodded and made his way toward the small, quiet room at the back of the center. Inside, he found Archer sitting in a chair by the window, arms wrapped tightly around his book, his small frame stiff with tension. Ethan approached carefully. Can I sit? Archer didn't look up. It's a free country. Ethan smirked despite himself. That it is. He took a seat across from him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Archer broke the silence. Why should I believe you? Ethan exhaled. Because it's Adults lie all the time, Archer said flatly. People say things to make kids feel better. Then they leave. Ethan's stomach twisted. I won't leave. Archer finally looked at him. You say that now, but what if it gets hard? What if you decide we're too much trouble? Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. That won't happen. Archer studied him, then shifted his book in his lap. Ethan glanced down and realized it wasn't just any book. It was Caroline's old programming notebook. A punch to the gut. Ethan swallowed. She was smart, he said softly. Archer's fingers tightened on the cover. You knew her, Archer said, finally acknowledging it. Did she talk about us? Ethan hesitated. Then, honestly, he said, I didn't know she had you. Archer stared at him for a long moment. Then, finally, softly, cautiously, he whispered, Did she love us? Ethan's breath caught, and suddenly nothing else mattered. Not his empire, not his fears, not his hesitation. Because this was the only question that ever mattered. More than anything, Ethan said. His voice was rough, raw. Archer's eyes glistened. For the first time, his guarded exterior cracked just a little. "You promise you won't leave?" Archer asked again. Ethan met his gaze. "I promise." Archer stared at him for another long moment, then slowly, hesitantly. He nodded, and Ethan knew. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't everything. But it was a start. Ethan Cole had expected resistance. He had prepared for anger, for shock, for disbelief. He had even anticipated rejection. But what he hadn't expected, what hit him harder than any boardroom battle, was how much he cared about the outcome. This wasn't just about correcting a past mistake or proving something to himself. This was about two little boys who had already been let down too many times, and he would be damned if he was another name on that list. The day after he told them the truth, Ethan waited. He expected Olivia to call, telling him the boys didn't want to see him. He expected the hesitation, the walls going back up. And when he arrived at Bright Futures, he was proven right. Jackson sat at a table in the rec center, idly tossing a baseball in the air, his usual spark dimmed. Archer was nowhere to be seen. Ethan's chest tightened. He approached slowly, pulling out a chair across from Jackson. "You mad at me?" Ethan asked. Jackson shrugged, catching the ball without looking up. "No." Ethan tilted his head. "But you're something." Jackson stopped tossing the ball, gripping it instead. "I just don't get it." "Don't get what?" Jackson finally looked up. His blue eyes, Ethan's blue eyes, were stormy with confusion. "Why now?" Ethan exhaled. "Because I didn't know before." Jackson frowned. "That's what you said yesterday." "It's the truth." Jackson looked down at the ball. "If you had known, would you have wanted us?" Ethan's heart clenched painfully. "Yes," he said firmly, without a doubt. Jackson was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, he muttered, "She didn't tell you." Ethan nodded. She didn't." Jackson scowled. "That's not fair." Ethan's throat tightened. "No, it's not." Jackson was quiet again, fingers pressing into the seams of the baseball. "Are you going to take us away from Miss Olivia?" Ethan hesitated. The truth was, he wanted to. He wanted to bring them home, give them everything they'd never had. But that wasn't how trust worked. "No," he said. "Not unless you want me to." Jackson blinked up at him. "You mean, we get to choose?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, you do." For the first time that morning, Jackson's shoulders relaxed, and Ethan realized maybe that was all they had ever wanted. Jackson wasn't the problem. Archer was. He had barely spoken since yesterday. He had skipped tutoring, skipped lunch, avoided Ethan completely. And Ethan wasn't about to let that slide. So when Olivia finally told him where to find Archer, he went. Ethan found Archer sitting alone in the small library at the back of Bright Futures, knees pulled to his chest, nose buried in a book. But Ethan wasn't fooled. Archer wasn't reading. He was hiding. Ethan walked in, took the seat across from him, and waited, and waited, and waited. Finally, Archer sighed dramatically and lowered the book. "You're still here," he muttered. Ethan smirked. "You're observant." Archer rolled his eyes and set the book down. "You don't have to talk to me," Ethan said. "But I'm not leaving." Archer scowled. "That's annoying." "Get used to it," Ethan said. Silence. Then, finally, Archer spoke. "I don't know what you want." Ethan exhaled. "I don't want anything from you." Archer narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Because I care about you," he said simply. Archer blinked. His fingers twitched against the book cover. "You don't know me," he muttered. Ethan smiled slightly. "That's why I'm here, to change that." Archer bit his lip, clearly struggling. You might leave. Ethan's chest. You say that now. Ethan felt the weight of those words, the hesitation, the fear of hoping for something, only to lose it. So he did something he'd never done before. He let Archer see him. You're right, Ethan admitted. I could say 1,000,000 words, make 1,000,000 promises, but none of that will matter until I prove it. Archer stared at him. Ethan met his gaze and said, So I will. Later that afternoon, Jackson convinced Archer to join them outside. Ethan didn't push. He didn't make grand gestures. Instead, he simply existed in their space. He played catch with Jackson. He helped Archer with a coding problem. He let them come to him. And when the afternoon came to an end, Archer spoke first. You'll be back tomorrow? Ethan nodded. If you want me to be. Archer hesitated. Then for the first time, he nodded. And just like that, Ethan won the hardest negotiation of his life. But Ethan's battles weren't over yet, because as he was leaving, Olivia stopped him. You should see this, she said, holding up a thick manila folder. Ethan frowned. What is it? Olivia's jaw tightened. It's about their past, she said, and you're not going to like it. Ethan took the folder. He opened it, and as his eyes scanned the pages, his blood turned to ice, because what he saw wasn't just custody records. It was something much worse. Medical reports, government files, and at the top of one page, a name he hadn't heard in over a decade. Dr. Victor Mercer. Ethan's grip on the paper tightened. The man who had once been a controversial researcher. The man who had vanished after being investigated for experimental trials. And the man who had, apparently, been involved in Archer and Jackson's early life. Ethan's entire body went cold. What the hell is this? He demanded. Olivia's expression was grim. That, she said, is the real reason why the boys have been stuck in the foster system for 10 years. Ethan clenched his fists. Because this wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about protecting his sons from something much darker. And whatever it took, he would find out the truth. Ethan Cole had never been a man who feared the unknown. His life had been built on facts, strategy, and absolute control. In business, unpredictability was a weakness. He had spent years eliminating every uncertainty from his empire, ensuring that nothing and no one could catch him off guard. But as he sat in Olivia Carter's office, staring down at the name Victor Mercer, he realized one thing. He was completely unprepared for this. You're sure about this? Ethan's voice was sharp, his grip tight on the manila folder. Olivia nodded, arms crossed. I triple-checked. Mercer's name is all over the boys' early medical records. Ethan's jaw clenched. How is that possible? That's what I've been trying to figure out, Olivia said, her voice tense. He vanished after multiple ethics violations were filed against him. No one could find him. No one knew where he went. Ethan flipped through the pages, scanning the disturbing details of Mercer's past experiments. Illegal genetic testing, unauthorized medical trials on infants, and government cover-ups. And Archer and Jackson's names were in these files. Ethan's stomach churned. Why were they part of this? Olivia exhaled. Because of their mother. Ethan's head snapped up. Caroline? Olivia nodded grimly. Before she passed away, she was involved in a research study. Mercer was leading it. She thought it was a legitimate program, something about tracking early cognitive development. But Mercer, he was doing a lot more than just tracking. Ethan's hands curled into fists. She had no idea, did she? His voice was dark, dangerous. Olivia shook her head. Not until it was too late. Ethan stared at the files, rage simmering beneath his skin. Someone had used Caroline, used his sons, and Mercer had gotten away with it. Until now. Ethan wasn't about to let that stand. He left Bright Futures that night with his mind spinning, his thoughts a tangled web of anger and urgency. But before heading home, he made a detour. The cemetery was quiet, the crisp autumn wind whispering through the trees as Ethan stepped onto the soft grass. He stopped in front of a small, modest gravestone. Caroline Reed, 1991 to 2019. For the first time in over a decade, he spoke to her. "You should have told me," he murmured, his voice rough. His hands tightened at his sides. "You should have trusted me." Silence. He hadn't been there when she needed him, and now he would never get the chance to ask her why. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing down the ache in his chest. "You did what you thought was right," he admitted. "But now I have to do the same." He looked down at her name one last time. Then, without another word, he walked away. Ethan wasn't in the mood for business. But that didn't stop his executive assistant, Vivian Shaw, from storming into his office. "You have 12 missed calls," she announced, dropping a tablet on his desk. "The board is restless. Mendoza is threatening to pull out of the AI acquisition. And—" She narrowed her eyes at him. "You're ignoring it all. Why?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his patience thin. "Because I have more important things to deal with," he said bluntly. Vivian froze. Ethan Cole never said that. "More important," she repeated, crossing her arms. "What could possibly be more important than the 2 sons I just found out I have?" Vivian's mouth fell open. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, softly, carefully, Vivian said, "Ethan." "What?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Archer and Jackson Reed. They're mine." Vivian sat down slowly, shock clear on her face. "You're serious?" Ethan nodded. "And you're— what? Planning to just step into their lives?" "That's exactly what I'm doing," he said. Vivian studied him carefully. Then, after a long moment, she sighed. "Okay," she said. Ethan blinked. "Okay?" She shrugged. "I've worked for you long enough to know you're going to do whatever you want. So, how can I help?" Ethan felt something in his chest loosen. Because if Vivian believed in him, maybe, just maybe, he could make this work. That afternoon, Ethan returned to Bright Futures. But the moment he walked through the doors, he knew something was wrong. Jackson was sitting on the floor, looking defeated. Archer stood beside him, fists clenched. And Olivia? Olivia was facing off against a man Ethan had never seen before. The moment Ethan saw the man's face, alarm bells rang in his head. The guy was tall, sharp-eyed, and too well dressed for someone visiting a foster center. Ethan's instincts screamed danger. "Who the hell is this?" Ethan asked, stepping forward. Olivia turned, her expression furious. "This," she said, "is the lawyer representing Dr. Victor Mercer." Ethan's body went still. "Mercer." The lawyer smirked. "Mr. Cole, I presume? I've heard a lot about you." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Not enough to know you should stay the hell away from my sons." Jackson flinched. Archer's eyes widened slightly. The lawyer's smirk widened. "Interesting," he said smoothly. "Because legally you don't have any claim to them, and my client would like to ensure that remains the case." Ethan's pulse spiked. "What the hell are you talking about?" The lawyer pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Dr. Mercer has been overseeing the medical care of Archer and Jackson for years," he said. "As part of a state-sanctioned program, their case files have remained under specific restrictions. And now that you're involved, Mr. Cole, my client has concerns." Ethan's fists curled. "You mean he's afraid I'll expose whatever the hell he's been doing?" The lawyer smiled. "We're just making sure everything stays quiet." Ethan saw red, but before he could take a step forward, Olivia grabbed his arm. "Not here," she whispered. "Not in front of the kids." Ethan forced himself to breathe, to think, to remember that Mercer wanted a reaction. So instead of exploding, Ethan turned to Olivia and said, "Get your best lawyer. Call whoever you need to." Then he looked at the lawyer. "Tell your client I'm coming for him." The lawyer didn't smile this time, and as he left, Ethan knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was war, and Ethan never lost. Ethan Cole had always known power was an illusion. It was something he had built, brick by brick, through calculated risks, strategic deals, and ruthless ambition. People bowed to him not because of who he was, but because of what he controlled. But standing in bright futures, watching the retreating back of Mercer's lawyer, Ethan realized something. For the first time, he was fighting a war where power wasn't enough, and that terrified him. Olivia shut the office door, her movements tense and controlled. She paced for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. "We have a problem," she said. Ethan exhaled sharply. "No kidding." She shot him a glare. "This isn't just about custody anymore. Mercer still has legal leverage over them. We need to find out what exactly he has, or he'll keep blocking us at every turn." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then we fight fire with fire," he said. Olivia narrowed her eyes. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means Mercer doesn't get to hide behind legal loopholes anymore." Ethan's voice was steel. "I want his entire background pulled apart. Every project, every deal, every government contract, everything." Olivia hesitated. "Ethan, this isn't some corporate battle. This is the foster care system, the state. There are rules." Ethan's cold smile sent a shiver down her spine. "Rules only matter when they're enforced," he said. Olivia sighed, rubbing a hand over her temple. "And what happens when Mercer comes at you with his own weapons?" Ethan met her gaze. "Then I make sure I hit harder." Back in his penthouse, Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering Manhattan skyline stretching beneath him. His phone rang. "Vivian." "You're working late," he said, answering. Vivian's voice was clipped. "You need to see what I just sent you." Ethan walked to his desk, opening the encrypted email she had forwarded. As the documents loaded, his entire body went still. Mercer hadn't just been involved in Archer and Jackson's medical history. He had been trying to claim legal guardianship for the last 3 years. Ethan's hands tightened into fists. That son of a bitch. "Where did you get this?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously low. Vivian exhaled. "It was buried deep in a sealed government database, but if he's trying to legally adopt them, that means he still thinks he owns them," Ethan finished. His pulse thundered. Vivian hesitated. "Ethan, if Mercer has government connections, this could get dangerous. We don't know who's protecting him." Ethan stared out at the city, his grip on the phone like iron. "I don't care," he said. "He's not getting my sons." The next morning, Ethan walked into Bright Futures, determined. Jackson and Archer were at a table working on their homework. When they looked up and saw him, Jackson grinned immediately. "You're here." Archer, as always, was quieter, but his sharp eyes studied Ethan closely. "You look mad," Archer observed. Ethan smirked despite himself. "Not mad. Focused." Jackson shrugged. "Sounds like the same thing." Ethan crouched to their level, serious now. "Listen to me," he said. "I need you both to know something." Jackson blinked. "What?" Ethan looked at both of them. "No matter what happens, I'm not going anywhere." Archer's fingers tightened on his pencil. "You promise?" Ethan met his gaze. "I promise." And in that moment, something changed. Because for the first time, Archer nodded. He believed him. That night, as Ethan stepped out of his car in front of his penthouse building, he sensed it before he saw it. A shadow lingering by the entrance. The moment Ethan turned, the man stepped forward, calm and composed. Mercer's lawyer. Ethan's muscles coiled. "Bold move," Ethan said coldly. "Showing up uninvited." The lawyer smirked. "My client wanted me to give you a message." Ethan folded his arms. "And?" The lawyer's expression darkened. "Stand down, or we'll make sure you regret it." Ethan's blood ran ice cold. "Is that a threat?" The lawyer smiled. "It's a warning." Ethan took a slow, controlled step forward, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You tell Mercer that if he tries to take my sons, I will bury him, legally, publicly, any way I have to." The lawyer's smirk flickered. Ethan leaned in. "And if he even thinks about hurting them?" His voice was steel. "There won't be a lawyer in the world who can save him from me." The lawyer finally looked uneasy. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Ethan watched him disappear into the night, rage burning in his chest. This wasn't just a custody battle anymore. This was war, and Ethan Cole never lost. Ethan Cole had spent his entire life dismantling obstacles. Business competitors, ruthless boardroom rivals, government regulations, none of them had ever stood a chance. But this wasn't a fight he could win with numbers or contracts. This was personal, and Mercer had just made a very big mistake. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he paced the length of his penthouse, the city skyline glowing behind him as he reviewed every piece of evidence he had gathered. The medical records, the sealed government documents, the attempted guardianship claims. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth. Mercer wasn't just trying to keep him away from the boys, he was hiding something. And whatever it was, Ethan was going to expose it. His phone buzzed. Vivian. He answered immediately. "Tell me you have something," he said. Vivian's voice was tight. "I do, but you're not going to like it." "Try me." There was a pause. Then, Mercer was trying to adopt other children too, ones with no families, ones that no one would notice. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Jesus," he muttered. "And that's not all," Vivian continued. "There's a sealed court order. Mercer was working with a private medical facility in Pennsylvania, a place that's off the grid." Ethan's jaw clenched. "What kind of facility?" Vivian hesitated. "One that was flagged for experimental trials on children." A dangerous silence filled the room. And then Ethan said, "Get me everything you can. And find out exactly where Mercer is. Because now this wasn't just about his sons. This was about stopping a monster." The next morning, Ethan arrived at Bright Futures with a purpose. He was done playing nice. Olivia was waiting for him, arms crossed. "You look like a man ready to do something reckless." Ethan smirked. "You'd be right," she sighed. "Should I even ask?" "You already know," he said. "We need to go after Mercer. Now." Olivia stiffened. "Ethan." "He's been targeting other kids, Olivia," Ethan interrupted. "This isn't just about Archer and Jackson anymore. If we don't stop him, he's going to keep doing this." Olivia's face paled. "Do you have proof?" Ethan nodded. "Vivian's digging up more, but it's bad." Olivia exhaled. "So what's the plan?" Ethan leaned in. "We take the fight to him." Before they could finalize their next steps, Archer stormed into the office. His face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists. "Why is some guy asking questions about us?" he demanded. Ethan's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" "A man," Archer said, his voice shaking. "He came to the center earlier, asking about me and Jackson, about our records." Ethan's blood went ice cold. "Who was he?" Archer's jaw tightened. "He said he was a lawyer. He left when Olivia told him to, but Archer swallowed hard. "But I know it was because of you," he whispered. Ethan inhaled sharply. He didn't want to do this now, didn't want to hurt Archer any more than he already had. But the kid deserved the truth. "It was Mercer," Ethan said. Archer flinched. Ethan crouched down, looking him in the eyes. "He's the reason you've been in the system this long. He's the reason your mother was afraid. And now, he's trying to take you and Jackson away from me." Archer's breathing quickened. "Why?" Ethan hesitated. Then carefully he said, "Because he thinks he owns you." Silence. Archer's hands shook. Ethan reached out, squeezing his shoulder. "But he doesn't, and he never will." Archer swallowed. "What are you going to do?" Ethan's eyes burned with fury. "I'm going to make sure he never hurts anyone again." That night, Ethan met Vivian in a black SUV outside a sleek glass building, Mercer's law firm. "Are you sure about this?" Vivian asked. Ethan's jaw was set. "Completely." Vivian handed him a thick file. "Everything you need is in here." Ethan took it. Then without hesitation he stepped out of the car and into the lion's den. Dr. Victor Mercer was exactly what Ethan had expected. A man who had built his life on secrets and arrogance. He was seated behind a massive desk, his suit crisp, his silver hair perfectly styled. He looked up as Ethan entered, his smile cold. "Mr. Cole," Mercer greeted smoothly. "What an unexpected surprise." Ethan didn't waste time. He tossed the file onto Mercer's desk. Mercer's smirk faltered as he flipped through the pages. "You're not as untouchable as you think," Ethan said, his voice low. "I have everything: the sealed court orders, the falsified medical reports, the attempted guardianship claims, the Pennsylvania facility." Mercer's jaw tightened. Ethan leaned in. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drop any and all claims to Archer and Jackson, and then you're going to disappear before I make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life in prison." Mercer chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You really think threats will work on me?" Ethan smiled. "Who said anything about threats?" He pulled out his phone, pressing a button. A second later, Mercer's computer screen lit up with an incoming news alert. "Breaking. Leaked documents link disgraced researcher to illegal foster care trials." Mercer's face drained of color. "You—" His voice wavered. "You leaked this?" Ethan smirked. "Number, but I made sure it got to the right people." Mercer's hands trembled. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan's expression hardened. "I protected my sons." By the next morning, Mercer was gone, fled the state, maybe the country, his empire destroyed. And Ethan, he had won. But the real victory? That came later, when he walked into Bright Futures and saw Archer and Jackson waiting for him. Jackson ran up first, grinning. "Did you really do it?" Ethan knelt, nodding. "Yeah, kid, he's gone." Jackson threw his arms around him, holding on tight. And then slowly, hesitantly, Archer stepped forward. He didn't say anything, didn't smile. But after a long pause, he reached out and grabbed Ethan's hand. Ethan's throat closed. Because that was everything. Ethan Cole had spent years chasing the next victory, the next deal, the next goal. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to fight. The enemy was gone. Mercer had fled. His legal grip on Archer and Jackson had crumbled under the weight of Ethan's evidence and the ensuing public scandal. The battle was over. Now the only thing that remained was the one thing Ethan had never planned for: fatherhood. Ethan stood outside Bright Futures, hands in his pockets, staring at the playground where Archer and Jackson were playing. No bodyguards, no lawyers, no crisis to fix. Just them. Olivia stepped beside him, watching the boys. "You did it," she murmured. Ethan huffed a short laugh. You sound surprised. She smirked. Not surprised, just impressed. Ethan turned to her. They're free now. They are, Olivia agreed. But freedom and stability aren't the same thing, Ethan. He exhaled. I know. She studied him, tilting her head. So what's your next move? Ethan looked back at the boys, watching as Jackson tackled Archer in the grass, both of them laughing. And for the first time, Ethan didn't have an answer. That evening, Ethan sat across from Archer and Jackson in Olivia's office. No boardroom table, no contracts. Just a conversation that mattered more than any deal he'd ever closed. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I want to talk to you both about what happens next. Jackson grinned. We get a mansion, right? Ethan smirked. We'll circle back to that. Archer crossed his arms. What do you mean, what happens next? Ethan met his gaze. I mean that you get to decide where you want to live. Silence. Archer's fingers curled slightly. You're saying, we get to choose? Ethan nodded. Yes, I want you with me, but I won't force you into anything you're not ready for. Jackson frowned. You're not just saying that to make us feel better, right? Ethan exhaled. No, Jackson. I'm saying it because I want you both to trust me. Jackson glanced at Archer. What do you think? Archer was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he asked the one thing Ethan hadn't expected. Are you going to disappear? Ethan's breath caught. Archer's face was blank, but his voice was tight. Even if we say no, will you leave? Ethan sat back, something sharp settling in his chest. No, he said, voice steady. I'll always be here, even if it takes years for you to be ready. Archer studied him. Then, slowly, he nodded. Ethan wasn't sure what that meant, but it was something. The next day, Ethan took Archer and Jackson to see his world, his penthouse, his office, the parts of his life that had always been kept behind steel and glass. Jackson loved it. This is crazy, he breathed, running around the living room. Dude, is that a whole wall of video games? Ethan smirked. That would be the entertainment suite. Jackson's eyes sparkled. I take back what I said. I definitely want to live here. Archer, on the other hand, was quiet. He wandered the penthouse, stopping at the large window overlooking Manhattan. Ethan walked up beside him. Too much? Archer shrugged. I don't know. Ethan waited. Then, finally, Archer turned to him. Have you ever been to our group home? Ethan stilled. No, he admitted. I haven't. Archer nodded. Then how do you know we'd like it here? Ethan inhaled sharply. And just like that, he understood. This wasn't about money or mansions. This was about home. Ethan turned to Jackson. Change of plans. Jackson blinked. Huh? Ethan grabbed his keys. We're going to your home next. Jackson hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Archer's shoulders relaxed, and Ethan knew he had made the right choice. For the first time, Ethan stepped into their world. The group home was small, simple, but filled with life. Kids ran down the halls. Volunteers helped with homework. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. And Ethan understood why Archer had needed him to see it. This wasn't just about where they would live. This was about respect. Ethan turned to them. Okay, now I get it. Archer raised an eyebrow. Do you? Ethan smirked. Yeah. You don't want a home that's forced on you. You want a choice. Archer crossed his arms. Obviously. Ethan knelt in front of them. Then here's the deal, he said. Wherever we go next, we choose together. Whether it's my place, a new house, or somewhere else entirely. Archer studied him. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, Archer said softly. Jackson grinned. Does that mean I get to help pick the house? Ethan chuckled. Yeah, kid, it does. Jackson fist-pumped. Sweet. And just like that, the decision was made. Together. That evening, for the first time ever, Archer and Jackson stayed at Ethan's penthouse. No official paperwork yet. No legal agreements. Just a trial run. Jackson loved it. He immediately sprawled across the massive couch, switching through game consoles like he had lived there for years. Archer, on the other hand, was more hesitant. He sat on the edge of his new bed, fingers running over the soft comforter. Ethan leaned in the doorway. "What do you think?" Archer shrugged. "It's nice." "But?" Archer hesitated. Then, softly, he said, "It doesn't feel real yet." Ethan nodded. "That's okay. We'll take it one day at a time." Archer finally met his gaze. "Promise?" Ethan crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "I promise," he said. Archer hesitated. Then, for the first time, he did something that nearly shattered Ethan's heart. He reached out and hugged him. Ethan froze for half a second. Then carefully he wrapped his arms around his son. His son. Archer pulled away quickly, clearly embarrassed. "That never happened." Ethan chuckled. "Of course not." Archer gave him a look, then yawned. "Get some sleep," Ethan said, ruffling his hair. Archer huffed but didn't protest as he climbed into bed. As Ethan stood and walked out, Jackson called from the living room. "Ethan, do we get ice cream before bed now? Is that a rich people thing?" Ethan laughed. "Nice try." Jackson groaned dramatically, and as Ethan stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of his son settling in, he realized something. He had spent his whole life chasing success, but this messy, chaotic, beautiful new life, was the only victory that had ever mattered. Ethan Cole had built his life around precision and control. Every decision, every move, every carefully planned acquisition had been strategic, designed to strengthen his empire, his wealth, his power. But fatherhood? There was no strategy for that. It was messy, unpredictable, and full of moments he never saw coming. And as he woke up to the sound of Jackson yelling about waffles from the kitchen, he realized something. This was the best decision he had ever made. Ethan stepped out of his bedroom, running a hand through his sleep-mussed hair as he followed the smell of something burning. The scene in the kitchen was pure chaos. Jackson stood on a stool, waving a spatula like a sword, while Archer stood beside him, arms crossed. "There's literally smoke," Archer pointed out. Jackson huffed. "It's fine. I got this." Ethan smirked, leaning against the doorway. "Should I be concerned?" Jackson turned, eyes bright. "Ethan, you're up. I made breakfast." Archer snorted. He burned breakfast. Jackson rolled his eyes. "It's just a little crispy." Ethan walked over, peering at the very charred waffles on the plate. He raised an eyebrow. Jackson grinned sheepishly. "You still have to eat them. It's a house rule." Ethan chuckled. "Who made that rule?" Jackson pointed at himself. "Me. Duh." Archer shook his head. "You don't have to eat them, Ethan. He made that rule up 5 seconds ago." Ethan sat down, picking up a waffle and examining it like it was a scientific experiment. Jackson watched closely. "Well, what do you think?" Ethan took a bite. It was terrible, but when he saw the hope in Jackson's face, he chewed, swallowed, and nodded. "Best burnt waffle I've ever had." Jackson beamed. Archer just rolled his eyes. "You're a terrible liar." Ethan smirked. "I have no idea what you're talking about." And just like that, they had a morning routine. Later that day, Ethan had no choice but to go to the office. His company was still running, and after weeks of chaos, he had to check in. Jackson and Archer weren't thrilled. "You're ditching us already?" Jackson whined. Ethan smirked. "I have a better idea. You're coming with me." Archer raised an eyebrow. "To your company?" Ethan nodded. Figured it's time you see what I do. Jackson perked up immediately. Do we get to boss people around? Ethan chuckled. Let's not traumatize my employees just yet. The moment Ethan stepped into the building with the boys, every single person froze. Ethan Cole never brought anyone into his world. And now? He had 2 kids trailing behind him, one wearing a Yankees cap backward and the other carrying a book about coding. Vivian was the first to recover. She blinked. Are those my sons? Ethan said smoothly. Jackson grinned. Hey, lady. Vivian narrowed her eyes. It's Vivian. Jackson tilted his head. Are you Ethan's boss? Vivian smirked. Some days it feels like it. Ethan snorted. Don't encourage him. Archer looked around, taking everything in. What do you actually do here? Ethan motioned for them to follow him into his office. Jackson immediately climbed into Ethan's chair, spinning in circles. I'm the CEO now. Ethan leaned against his desk. Oh yeah? What's your first order of business? Jackson tapped his chin. More snacks in the break room and nap time. Ethan chuckled. I'll run it by the board. Archer, meanwhile, was looking at Ethan's computer setup. This is cool, he murmured. Can I see what kind of programs you build? Ethan raised an eyebrow. You know how to code? Archer shrugged. A little. Ethan's chest tightened. This kid, he was so much like him. Come here, Ethan said, pulling up a coding window. I'll show you something. And for the next hour, Ethan taught Archer how to write his first proper program. It was the most peaceful hour he'd had in years. That night, after dinner, and an intense video game battle that Jackson won, Ethan tucked the boys into bed for the first time. It was awkward. None of them were used to it. Jackson yawned, stretching. This is nice, he mumbled sleepily. I like it here. Ethan's chest warmed. I like having you here. Jackson grinned. Are we getting a dog? Ethan chuckled. We'll talk about it. That means no, Jackson muttered. Ethan smirked, ruffling his hair. Good night, kid. Jackson grumbled but smiled as he drifted off. Ethan stepped into Archer's room nexo. Archer was sitting up, reading. But when Ethan walked in, he closed his book. Need anything? Ethan asked. Archer hesitated. Then, softly, Are you coming to the parent meeting tomorrow? Ethan blinked. What parent meeting? Archer looked down. At school. They have them every month. We never had anyone show up before. Ethan's throat tightened. I'll be there, he said immediately. Archer studied him. You promise? Ethan knelt beside the bed. I promise, he said firmly. Archer held his gaze for a long moment. Then quietly, cautiously, he muttered, Okay. And when Ethan turned off the light, he knew. For the first time, Archer believed him. The next day, Ethan Cole walked into a middle school auditorium full of teachers and parents. Every single person stared. Because Ethan Cole, the Billionaire CEO, was sitting at a tiny school desk, listening to a math teacher talk about fractions. Jackson leaned over, whispering, Everyone's looking at you. Ethan smirked. I get that a lot. Jackson giggled. Archer, sitting beside him, was quiet. But when Ethan glanced over, he saw something different in his son's face. Pride. And for the first time, Ethan realized. This was the best deal he had ever made. Ethan Cole had spent his life chasing success, power, and control. Now, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching Archer and Jackson playfully bicker over a chessboard, he realized something. None of it mattered without them. It had been 3 months since Mercer had vanished. 3 months since Ethan had taken full custody of the boys. 3 months since his entire world had changed. His once pristine penthouse was now lived in. There were soccer cleats by the front door, comic books on the coffee table, and science projects scattered across his desk. And Ethan? Ethan had never felt more at peace. He glanced over at Olivia, who was leaning against the railing, a glass of wine in hand. "You're staring," she teased. Ethan smirked. "You're the one who keeps showing up here. Should I be concerned?" Olivia rolled her eyes. "I'm here to make sure you're actually surviving fatherhood." Ethan chuckled. "And?" She arched a brow. "You're doing better than I expected." Ethan tilted his head. "You mean I'm not a complete disaster?" She sipped her wine. "Not yet." He smirked, watching as Jackson groaned dramatically when Archer took his queen. "They're happy," Olivia murmured. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, they are." She studied him for a moment. "And you?" Ethan hesitated. He had everything, his company, his wealth, his sons. And yet, something was missing, or rather someone. His eyes flickered to Olivia, the woman who had challenged him, fought with him, and believed in him when no one else did. Ethan set his glass down. "Olivia." She turned, raising an eyebrow. "I need to ask you something," he said. She smirked. "If it's about your tie selection again, I swear—" "Stay." Her breath hitched. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softer now. "Stay in our lives, not just as their guardian or their social worker." He hesitated. "Stay because you belong here, because you belong with us." Olivia stared at him, eyes wide. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan continued. "Just think about it." Olivia swallowed hard, then glanced at the boys. Archer was quietly watching them, waiting. Jackson, oblivious, was grinning at his chess victory. And Olivia? She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I don't need to think about it," she whispered. Ethan's heart stopped. Then, softly, she said, "I'm already staying." That night, as Ethan tucked the boys into bed, Jackson yawned, blinking up at him sleepily. "Hey, Ethan?" Ethan sat on the edge of his bed. "Yeah?" Jackson hesitated. Then, carefully, he asked, "Can I call you Dad?" Ethan's breath caught. His throat burned. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he cleared his throat and nodded. "Yeah, kid," he said, his voice rough. "You can—" Jackson grinned, then immediately passed out. Ethan turned to see Archer watching him. Unlike his brother, Archer didn't say it out loud. But as Ethan turned off the lamp and started to leave, Archer reached out, just for a second, and grabbed his hand. And in that moment, Ethan knew. He had won his son's trust. For real this time. Later that night, as Ethan walked Olivia to the elevator, she turned to him. "You sure you're ready for this?" she teased. Ethan smiled. "For the first time in my life," he murmured, "I'm sure of everything." She stared at him for a moment. Then, shaking her head fondly, she pulled him in and kissed him. It was soft, slow, and long overdue. When she pulled away, she smirked. "You're not as scary as you think you are, Cole." Ethan chuckled. "Don't tell anyone. It'll ruin my reputation." She grinned, stepping onto the elevator. Oh, as the doors closed, Ethan exhaled slowly. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. Ethan had spent years believing money was the only thing that mattered. But now? Now he had something priceless. A home, a family, and a love that no amount of wealth could ever buy. And as he turned back to the penthouse, his home, he knew one thing for certain. This question mark. This was just the beginning.